for some more Charles Dickens and A Christmas Carol. We're now at Stave 3. A Christmas Carol is divided into 5 parts, 5 readings, what we know as staves. Tonight's stave will be read by Alicia Sando, and it's about Christmas in the present time for Ebenezer Scrooge. He's looked at a legacy of his past. He's beginning to learn. He's on the journey of his transformation. And now he's going to see what he's been missing all these years through the ghost of Christmas present, the parties, the fun, the joy. And he begins to get really excited. And in fact, tonight you're going to see that Ebenezer is going to see Christmas in a whole new light.
Stave 3, the second of the 3 spirits. Awaking in the middle of a prodigiously tough snore, and sitting up in his bed to get his thoughts together, Scrooge felt that he was restored to consciousness in the right nick of time. For he lay upon his bed, the very core and center of a blaze of ruddy light which streamed upon it, and which, being only light, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts. He began to think that the source and secret of this ruddy light might be in the adjoining room, from whence it seemed to shine. He got up and shuffled in his slippers to the door. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by his name and bade him enter. He obeyed. It was his own room, there was no doubt about that, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were so hung with living greens that it looked a perfect grove, from every part of which bright gleaming berries glistened, and the crisp leaves of mistletoe, holly, and ivy reflected back the light. And such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney as that dull petrification of a hearth had never known in Scrooge's time or Marley's. Heaped up on the floor to form a kind of throne were turkeys, geese, game, great joints of meat, long wreaths of sausages, mince pies, plum puddings, apples, juicy oranges, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. In easy state upon this couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see, who bore a glowing torch and held it up to shed his light on Scrooge as he came peeking round the door. "I am the ghost of Christmas present," said the spirit. "Look upon me." Scrooge reverently did so. It was clothed in one simple green robe, bordered with white fur. On its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath, set here and there with shining icicles. Its dark brown curls were long and free as the cheery voice and its joyful air. "You have never seen the like of me before," exclaimed the spirit. "Spirit," said Scrooge submissively, "conduct me where you will." "Touch my robe," said the spirit. Scrooge did as he was told, and held it fast. All vanished instantly, and they stood in the city streets on Christmas morning. Soon the steeples called good people all to church and chapel, and away they came flocking through the streets in their best clothes and with the gayest faces. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost that, notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and that he stood beneath a low roof quite as gracefully as it was possible he could have done in any lofty hall. It was his own kind, generous, hearty nature, and his sympathy with all poor men, that led him straight to Scrooge's clerk, for there he went, and Scrooge with him, holding to his robe. And on the threshold of the door, the spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinklings of his torch. "Is there a peculiar flavor in what you sprinkle from your torch?" said Scrooge. "There is," said the spirit. "Does it apply to anybody on this day?" asked Scrooge. "To any kindly given. To a poor one most." "Why to a poor one most?" asked Scrooge. "Because he needs it most." Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Bob's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons. And now 2 smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside they had smelt the goose and known it for their own. And basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onions, these young Cratchits danced about the table, while exalted Master Peter Cratchit, with the corners of his monstrous shirt-collar, Bob's private property conferred upon his son and heir in honor of the day, nearly choking him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes bubbling up knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. "Here's Martha, mother!" cried the 2 young Cratchits. "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, and how late you are!" said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her daughter, and taking off her shawl and bonnet with officious zeal. In came Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim! He bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. "And how did little Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, after Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people saw him in the church, because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Bob's voice was tremulous when he told them this, and trembled more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken. Bob, turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with lemons, and stirred it round and round, and put it on the hob to simmer. Master Peter and the 2 ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought a goose was the rarest of all the birds. The 2 young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and at last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. There never was such a goose. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness, were the themes of universal admiration. Everyone had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onions to the eyebrows. But now, the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Mrs. Cratchit left the room to take the pudding up and bring it in. In half a minute Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed and smiling proudly with the pudding, like a speckled cannon-ball blazing in half of a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedight with Christmas holly stuck on the top. "Oh, wonderful pudding!" Bob Cratchit said, and he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. At last the dinner was all done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. The compound in the jug being tasted and considered perfect, apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts put upon the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew around the hearth, and at Bob's elbow stood the family display of glass, 2 tumblers, and a custard cup without a handle. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us," which all the family re-echoed. "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with an interest he had never felt before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat," replied the ghost, "in the poor chimney corner, and the crutch without an owner carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Spirit, say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future," returned the ghost, "none will find him here. What then? If he be like to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population. Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit, and bent before the ghost's rebuke. All this time the chestnuts in the jug went round and by there was a song about a lost child travelling in the snow, from Tiny Tim, who had a plaintive little voice, and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of high mark in this. They were not a handsome family. They were not well dressed, and their clothes might have known the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded, and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, it was a great surprise to Scrooge to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise to recognize it as his own nephew's, and to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by his side. "Ha-ha!" laughed Scrooge's nephew. "Ha-ha-ha! He said that Christmas was a humbug, and he believed it too. He's a comical old fellow, and not so pleasant as he might be. However, his offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him. I have no patience with him," observed Scrooge's niece, and all the others expressed the same opinion. "I was only going to say," said Scrooge's nephew, "that he might rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him, if he finds me going there in good temper year after year, and saying, 'Uncle Scrooge, how are you? So here is a glass of mulled wine ready to our hand at the moment,' and I say, 'A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man wherever he is.'" Then Scrooge's nephew laughed in his way. Scrooge's niece laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends, being not a bit behindhand, rolled out lustily, "Uncle Scrooge!" Uncle Scrooge has imperceptibly become so gay and light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return, if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and he and the spirit were again upon their travels. Much they saw, and far they went, but always with a happy end. The spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful. In almshouse, hospital, and jail he left his blessing, and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night. It was strange, too, but while Scrooge remained unaltered in his outward form, the ghost grew clearly older. Scrooge observed this change, and as the spirit stood in an open place, he noticed that his hair was gray. "Are spirits' lives so short?" asked Scrooge. "My life upon this globe is very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight. Hark, the time is drawing near." The chimes were ringing the 3/4 past the 11 at that period. "Forgive me in what I ask," said Scrooge, looking intently at the spirit's robe, "but I see something strange and not belonging to yourself. Your robe." From the folding of the spirit's robe it brought 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, miserable. They knelt down at its feet and clutched upon the outside of his garment. "Spirit, are they yours?" Scrooge could say no more. "They are man's," said the spirit, looking down upon them, "and they cling to me, appealing from their fathers. This boy is ignorance, this girl is want. Beware of them both, and all of their degree, but most of all beware this boy, for on his brow I see that written which is doom, unless the writing be erased." "Have they no refuge or resource?" cried Scrooge. "Are there no prisons?" said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. "Are there no workhouses?" The bell struck 12. Scrooge looked for the ghost, and saw it not.